Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I believe the way we'll do it tonight is I'm going to present a series of slides. And Rainier, if you got questions or comments, type them in. Rainier and the crew can interrupt me and say, please stop for a second. I think it's a very important question on X, Y, and Z. So with that, I'm going to go share my screen and then we'll get into it. There's about 45 slides, but I'm going to go through a lot of them pretty quickly because I want to get a couple of concepts going here. And as I do that, I think it'll be obvious, the flow of all that. So we're going to talk about cybersecurity on the impact of the future. And I'm Steve MacLellan. And for the presentation tonight, just a little disclaimer, what I'm going to represent tonight is my own personal viewpoint, not that of VMware or any other company. And we're going to cover a couple things. I'll introduce myself briefly so you know my background, but then I'm going to kind of talk about the present a little bit, a little peek on the future, because I think the present is pretty dismal at the moment to many people, but I'm a real optimist, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll kind of give an early look-see at some technologies. Then we'll talk about cybersecurity, a very key component in securing the future, especially as the future is connected. Then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into 3 scenarios, which I think will bring out, many of the problems of why cybersecurity is so important in the future. We're going to talk about electric vehicles. We're going to talk about Industry 4.0 and the IoT, IIoT, and the OT technologies. Then a little glimpse of smart cities. And then we'll kind of do a call to action. And that's how we're going to proceed here tonight. Again, any questions, please give them to Rainier and the crew, and I'll stop presenting and we'll answer the question. So who am I? I'm Steve MacLellan. And I work at a great company called VMware. I'm a very fortunate person on this. VMware is a company that deals with building the secure multi-cloud, both on-prem and enterprise, and also in the cloud with AWS and Google GCP, Azure, and many other platforms. It's a great place to work, wonderful people. And I'm especially lucky at this point in the present and positioning for the future to be part of the VMware team. I'm an advisory CISO there, a very interesting role. I've been doing cybersecurity for over 30 years. My background in cyber goes back actually to college, and even a little bit before that. But in my world of mainframes, we use something called the Air Force Orange Book, how to secure systems. So I have a great experience in cyber. But I also was responsible for building out Fidelity's internet and cybersecurity practice from the ground floor. And that was a very interesting experience because you had to invent it as you go. Just some other recent things I've done. I've been at SAP, where I worked for Tim McKnight, the CSO there, very interesting company, very large global company. For 26 years at Fidelity Investments, where I was the Senior Vice President of Enterprise Cybersecurity and Enterprise Architecture, and many other jobs. I also have my own consulting company, which I did investments. We work with strategic consulting clients, everything from Cardinal Health to CV Telecom in West Africa. And I've also done, a lot of international work. We said on the pre-call here, over 40 countries I've worked in, and quite a bit of stuff on fintech. I also come as a unique perspective into cyber because I started my career, and I went through a lot of my career being a developer. And developers think about things differently than a lot of other people do. You have to create things. A long experience with that. And finally, I would consider myself an inventor, innovator, founded a series of companies, a series of initiatives. Some of them you would have heard of, by the way. Founder of the Advanced Cybersecurity Center, which I'm very proud of, which has really taken on a life of its own with Bill Gunther. Was a co-founder, done some security startups, BGA, Integrators, et cetera, worked all around the world on this stuff. And I'm pretty well educated. And I'll just let you know, every month, maybe sometimes 4 or 5 times a month, I'm actually taking classes, both at the university level, whether it's be Harvard, MIT, or some other schools, Eckerd College, BC, whatever, or online, whether it be VMware or on LinkedIn Learning, whatever. So I'm really committed to that. And the other part of my background is I have a long history within financial services in fintech. And I've kind of hinted at that a little bit tonight. So I'm very sensitive to the areas of fraud, customer data, PII data, and the regulations around these things. These are very complex ecosystems with millions of customers, trillions of dollars of assets, and it kind of has formed how I think about things. So that's enough about me, because really we're here to talk a little bit about the present, but talk about the future. And if you put on your hat of all things are bad, you look at the world today and say, oh my word, planet's warming, oceans are rising, we have hurricanes, human population now at 8 billion, tremendous pressure on the natural resources around the world, deadly diseases, COVID, environments are under pressure, supply chains are failing, inflation goes up, food insecurity, and global tensions, I'll just say, is really at the worst I think it's been in 60 years. It's been the worst in my lifetime, in fact, with the conflict with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And on top of that, I'll just say a theme that I observe is this wealth gap between rich and poor is increasing. And to me, that's a very bad thing relative to global stability. But at the same time, these bad things are going on. You know, I think you can look around you and look at your friends, talk to your families and your coworkers and within your communities and your countries, and there's good reason to be optimistic. I think that people understand now the threat of global warming and working together. I think alternative energy is now mainstream. I'll tell you a very shocking thing for me. I was in Beijing, China. This is part of my little stories that Rainier likes to hear. And we're driving around Beijing in a taxi, looking around, and I'd never seen so many Teslas, electronic Teslas in one place. And I thought this was very strange. And we went and we talked with folks about it, and it was because the air pollution was so bad from the power generation that and with the diesel cars and everything polluting, the real big push to get electric vehicles. And to me, that was a very, very, very positive sign of things going on in the world, to start seeing alternative energy. In fact, the number one, this is an unrehearsed fact, the number one installer of wind power in 2022 is the country of China, which is almost 50% of all the installed wind base this year. And that's amazing to me. Technology innovation continues. Water conservation is a very interesting area. We'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. Drugs are going on, environmental awareness, supply chains are starting to ease, but we get a little bit of nationalism emerging. And I finally think that, you know, I think economic models and tools are being adopted, I think, to embrace the poor and to let everyone participate, I think, in the economic development and growth opportunities and benefits of that, by the way. So I'm an optimist. So the question really for this presentation today is what's next, because this is about the future. Here's a couple of peeks at what's going on into the future. Oh, and Rainier will notice I misspelled the word peak here. The first one is electric vehicles. And we'll talk about that in detail in a couple minutes, but this zero carbon transportation evolution that's going on is really a big deal. And I'm going to talk about how cybersecurity professionals can get engaged with this and protect it. It's very important. The second thing I think is a smart edge. This is Internet of Things, the industrial Internet of Things, OT, which is operational technologies. And it's how to bring all of this stuff now into manufacturing devices and industrial process. Very important thing. Smart cities. I actually was in Beijing, China, working with the head of the Smart City Initiative there. And within the quality of life in large cities, there's traffic, there's pollution, there's noise, right? There's all the utilities. There's how to just move people around, how to safety, environmental concerns. We're going to talk about that a little bit and how important this stuff is. The smart grid. Here's an interesting one. Out of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's almost $200 billion of money to help build out the next gen electrical infrastructure within the United States. This is a big deal. The grid we have today was put in during the 1930s. Just think about that. So that's like 90 years ago. This system was put into place, and it's still running, which is an amazing thing about the engineering, but it's not ready for the next gen. Connected homes, cloud, carbon reduction. I listened to pitches for startups out of the UK 2 weeks ago. And one of the most interesting companies, they demonstrated how to take CO2 and hydrogen use that together with some industrial processes and actually generate e-fuel, net zero green gasoline. And it was just an amazing thing to see this, but it gives me a lot of hope for the future. Medical, AR, VR, metaverse, AI, ML, and finally, I think there's a lot of movement in terms of electronic government, especially outside the United States. When I travel in Africa or other places, I do see quite an interesting push towards e-gov in order to get people engaged locally and very low cost and very transparently. So I think these things are very important for the future. If you talk to experts, and I'm not going to consider myself an expert, if you talk to experts at McKinsey, experts at Forrester, experts at the World Bank, experts at Gartner, they will talk about these key trends. And I'm just going to just talk about these. And then during the presentation, I'm going to relate how these will solve some of these problems, what the role is, and also what your role is and my role is in order to improve this and make it work great. So I think the first one is process automation. We talked about this industrial IoT, IIoT, OT technologies. We're going to be talking more about that. Robots, cobots, and RPA. RPA means robotic process automation. And I think that that's how to take these things and now take them out of the social realm and then put them into the manufacturing industrial realm. I think the second part of it is process virtualization. This concept of digital twins is important to a connected future where I can simulate a physical device in a virtual way in order to understand behavior, and also then I can replay it, and also to try things to see what I can do to improve it. I think there's a lot of stuff going on in connectivity, distributed infrastructure, especially in terms of cloud. I work for VMware, #1 cloud technology provider in the world. We're very much into this. This is a very important part of it. Next gen computing, quantum computing. You should pay very close attention to this, for there's good side of quantum and bad side of quantum. We could spend a whole hour, maybe 2 or 3 hours, talking about what quantum computing is, how it works, but it also creates some very interesting problems relative to protection of encryption. So the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, NIST, has now published some working groups and recommendations on quantum resistant encryption, and more on that in another talk. Neuromorphic chips, I worked with an Israeli startup and a US startup on how to make analog chips in order to do very, very fast convergent AI for vision systems in near real time, which is on very low tech, low processing power, very, very important thing. AI, future programming. I'll say this, there's a big movement going on in the background to, instead of having programmers, have individuals who are expert but non-programmers tell the system what to do, use AI and some generation technology to generate the next generation of software. And I think software is one of those things which is preventing our future from moving ahead. Trust architectures. I have mixed feelings about the word zero trust. I understand the concept, obviously, very well from VMware and from my previous work. I think the real question is, how do we have a trust architecture of which we assume zero trust and then you earn trust? I think that's a very important future architecture. Blockchain involves some blockchain companies, everything from Jarvis Industries to companies that use this with Attested. I'm a big believer in blockchain as an important part of the future. And then finally, some stuff on an industry stuff, very specific stuff, bio-revolutions, next-gen materials, and finally, clean energy. There are people working on the next-gen nuclear technologies, not just nuclear fusion, which of course is what happens at the inside of stars, but how to do safe nuclear fission. You're using materials which are low radioactivity, which can be actually handled, and when combined together at a critical mass will generate heat and thus power. And so I think these are the top 10 that McKinsey, and I'm in agreement with this particular list. The reason to stay focused on these is McKinsey also believes, and this is what they go in to talk to boards about, CEOs, CFOs, COOs, industry leadership, government funders, and governments, by the way, is that these technologies are likely to yield a very large quantum in productivity, whether it's in terms of automation or connectivity, distributed architecture. On number 6, on the programming side, they actually believe that 10 years from now, you could have a 30-fold reduction in time and effort and cost in order to generate code and everything. An interesting technical point, we could talk about this for a whole hour, is on open source. Open source was one start of the programming revolution, and about 85 to 90% of all code that's used in applications actually is open source, whether it be from the Apache project or one OpenSQL or one of the other projects. Trust architectures on blockchain. This is a very interesting one because blockchain is not just about money. It's not just Bitcoin, Ethereum, other types of digital currency. It's also a distributed digital ledger technology that allows you to have a trust architecture that when I do a transaction, a permissioned person can see it. It's safe, it's encrypted, and it can't be modified. And it's there as I can go back, I have proof of work, or I have proof of stake, or I've got proof of the transaction. It's a very important part. There's a lot of things in the global economy which are inefficient because banking systems are involved. Trust architecture like blockchain are meant to democratize the world of finance and actually cause an economic shift, a big power shift from the rich to the poor. It's a very important part of the future. Bio-revolution, next-gen materials, and finally the clean technology. Energy alone, just to give you a scale of this, energy alone is a $4 trillion global business between just two fuels, gasoline and diesel fuel. $4 trillion. That's the opportunity. And if you can reduce our use of carbon impacting global warming fuels, either through e-fuel or reduction or electronic vehicles or alternative fuels or et cetera, this is a big deal because think of $4 trillion and reducing that cost, even by 50%, you can return $2 trillion to the global economy for other things, by the way, like medicine, like building roads, infrastructure, clean water. And this is a very interesting part of these are not net zero sum games going on. These are very important long-term social consequencing decisions and technologies. And if we're putting money into carbon-based fuels, we're hurting our future, but we're also taking money away from us. If we can invest in renewable fuel, renewable infrastructure, we're positioning ourselves for better, longer-term growth and take that money and put it to something else to help the world. I think it's very important. Gartner, which is
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
Quick question for you. So one of the things that always comes up when we think about these innovations and how they're going to shape the world is, of course, the impact on jobs. And so how are jobs going to be impacted and shaped when we think about all this change that we're looking at?
Sure. By the way, that is an excellent question. I don't have the exact number. I think we could take a future discussion and talk about that, but I'll give you an analogy.
Well, I've heard that you're looking at 375 million jobs that are going to be lost to automation over the next 10 years. Now, of course, there's also going to be a lot of jobs being generated, of course. So it's not that. So
yeah, exactly. So let's just take China as an example. China is putting in half the world's capacity of wind turbines. You think about who makes those? General Electric, right? All these companies make here, the electronic Siemens electronic components. What it's doing is it's shifting where the jobs are. And I think part of an economy has to be nimbleness. Nimbleness is catalyzed by education. And I would say an educated country is nimble relative to moving between these sectors. So if I was shoveling coal or handling the gas-fired plant, and now I'm servicing wind turbines and PV photovoltaic farms and doing something else, I think the types of jobs are different and require different skills, Rainier. And I think that as a society, we owe it to ourselves, to our people, to the future, to position people for the future in terms of skills, education, experience, learning, etc. Those programmers, by the way, there's a worldwide, I think the number, no, I won't be too far off on the number. There's probably like 70 million professional programmers around the world. right? There's a shortage of programmers. So if you get this gain, what those programmers do, Rainier, is they may move to some other industry which has a great need for programmers. So again, we'll talk about 3 examples later on. But I'm convinced that these opportunities are so large in the future. I'm convinced they're going to create a new classes of jobs. And by the way, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, no one even knew about the internet. You know, they didn't know about smartphones. They didn't know about PCs. They weren't even invented yet. And in the prediction at the time, Rainier, was that, oh, these will kill jobs. And it did completely different. What happened was this new wave of wealth creation and knowledge creation and technology creation happened. And the people, by the way, look at the United States, the people who lead these companies, by the way, are many times they're immigrants from countries. They're highly trained engineers. They come here and they're successful. They build new industries. They attract talent. They create jobs. And I'm very optimistic about this, Rainier. If I was a coal miner, or for example, my grandfather worked in a plastics factory and in a shoe factory. Very dangerous jobs, bad chemicals, very dangerous, demanding work. Had an opportunity, he could have done a different job with a different skill set to use his mind, rather than his hands and his back. It would have been a different opportunity for him, and so I'm optimistic on it, Rainier.
And I think that's the important thing for people to understand, that
Yes.
Technology is really an enabler. I mean, if you think about
That's exactly
the way we live today relative to the way people lived 50 years ago, when technology was in its infancy, and I think it still is in its infancy. But technology has transformed the way we live and work and everything we do, right? But I think that for those of us that are in the field and in the industry, I think that it's such an amazing opportunity for economic development within underserved countries, communities, and people in general. And I just wish more people would be aware of that. And I wish more governments would take the time to invest in the education of their people.
Yes.
So that they can really take advantage of the opportunities that are there, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that now is the time to be thinking about this. And again, I don't think anyone 40 years ago could envision where we are today on technology. And the other part about it, which is completely non-obvious, is that life expectancy, up until COVID, by the way, every year in the United States was increasing. And for the first time in history of the United States, life expectancy has dropped. Average male life expectancy is, I believe, 73.6 years now. And where it was like at 78, 79 years. But on the other hand, our technology allowed us to do new classes of vaccines, delivery systems, testing systems, and allow us to fight the disease. And we're not done with that yet, of course. But, so the technology is an interesting double-edged sword here, but I'm more optimistic. But I think education, training, and positioning, I think, is for countries that do that, and for people that do that, and communities that do that, to me, that is how you win the future, is through education.
And then along those same lines, just an even deeper question on that. How do you feel, how can these trends benefit poor countries, especially those with highly unequal social systems?
Yeah, and you heard me raise that earlier. And again, having worked in Africa in 2 places, in West Africa, I will say that the internet is a great equalizer. And what I mean by that is, like, let's take M-Pesa. So in West Africa, there's a digital currency called M-Pesa, which is used to transact and do business. In doing on the internet, Rainier, so there are technologies which they can do local economies without necessarily the big money center banks of the US and the UK and the EU, taking advantage or taking fees out. So that's one way. But I think the other way is very interesting. And China knows this, and India knows this, and other countries do. Great minds are everywhere. I said this to Cecilia at the beginning. You go around the world and you meet wonderful people. Great minds are every place around the world. I can create a product in India or in China or in Africa or in Buenos Aires or in Argentina or Dominican, It doesn't matter, right? The trick is, how do I deliver that to the market in the way that the market can consume it? That's kind of a different question. And I think as we go ahead with these services, I think that is an equal opportunity, by the way, for countries to fund these startups. And I'll use a very specific example. I'm going to be in Northern Ireland in 3 weeks. The reason I'm going there with the UK government is Northern Ireland is a traditionally very poor part of the UK. And they've been funding some startups there. And these startups are in cybersecurity, e-fuels, carbon capture, medical devices. These companies, and I'll actually mention one a little later on, because they're emerging as leaders. So leadership for the future can come from anywhere. And if it comes from Northern Ireland or Cabo Verde or Venezuela or the Dominican, I think they have an equal chance at success, especially with regional economies, by the way. And you brought this up earlier. I think the regional development banks in Africa especially are very sensitive to this, Rainier, and want to build a future which are not so dependent on the superpowers, but they have an economy which they can service the superpowers, more importantly, service themselves. And I think that this is a very complicated discussion, and a very important part of the discussion about the future.
And do you feel that what action can the individual take? Because although I advocate for government investment,
yes,
and I think it's absolutely necessary, it's also something that takes a long time. And the level of bureaucracy that you often, and I would say that's an unfair comment, actually. It's not that it's just a lot of bureaucracy. Yes, you have bureaucracy in government across the entire globe, obviously.
right.
But when you're trying to make large social change, it's a very slow train. And it's like trying to steer a container ship, right? And so what can the individual do to begin to benefit from some of these societal changes that we're looking at?
Yeah,
especially folks that are really underserved.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I'll just make two general comments. I think most innovation, by the way, doesn't come from government. It comes from individuals. That's number one. But I think the thing that opens the door to innovations, that allows you to get to the table, is education, by the way. But on the other hand, and I know this from my own upbringing, I grew up in very modest means, would be an understatement, and for a family of eight kids. And I worked full-time in college and immediately had to start working, et cetera. I think an investment in education is undervalued, by the way. But we have to find ways of getting people into the education system in a way that meets them where they are, right? At a much different price point. Education is way out of whack here in the United States, and much more aligned with the Canadian or the European models or African models, et cetera, in terms of the price point. And we have to make sure the education admission process is fair and equitable, the costs are low and reasonable, that we give people tools to succeed, because not everyone's coming from the same experience from high school or secondary school. And I think you have to create opportunities. I'll just say this, and I am a strain, when you and I have talked about this with Black Girls Code and some of the other initiatives, Rainier, is that, again, smart people are everywhere. And not everyone's going to go through the college process. It doesn't today, by the way. It's just a shocking statistic to me. 60-something%, I forgot the exact number, maybe 65% of all college admissions in the last 2 years have been females, not males. And if you look at the graduation rate within males, within the United States, the college graduation rate for males, I think, is about somewhere to 35 and 38%. That's it, by the way. And in these kind of futures, if you want to make, the most difference and get economic rewards, higher education is very important. And the question, a much complicated question, Rainier, is that higher education given through certificate programs? Is it given through the university programs? Is it done through graduate programs? Is it done through on-the-job training? And I think it's some combination of all these things. But I think it's impossible to participate in this future without education of whatever form it is, by the way. I mean, I was exceptionally fortunate in high school to be able to take a college level programming class when I was 15 years old. It was a gift. It opened a door, and I wouldn't be where I am today without that door. And that was just shocking to me in hindsight. And I did nothing to deserve that door. We have to figure out how to open those doors for other people.
Yeah,
And,
no, I agree completely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was in a meeting late last week with a senior administrator from a pretty large university, and you know, we were talking about working together and partnering and different things. And I was sharing our curriculum, and you know, he was floored. He's like, "How can people get a job with that?" And I'm like, "Well, this is exactly what employers are looking for." And he's like, "Oh, we teach all those things." I'm like, "Yeah, but you also spend a lot of time teaching a whole bunch of other things that are not immediately relevant." And you know, and so I was trying to explain the difference, that we're not an educational program, we're a jobs program. We're trying to get people a job.
Exactly. And by the way, getting people jobs is probably the most important element in terms of just economic success, just plain success. Because without the job, you don't have the insurance, you don't have the money, you don't have good housing, you're limited in choices of where to live, your transportation, the whole thing. It all comes from jobs. And it's probably beyond the scope of this discussion today on how to solve that. But I think it is one of the most critical discussions if we're going to succeed in the future in here. Otherwise, you know, the people who will be under the thumb of industrialists and the capitalism system, you know, will have no choice on the future of where they live, transportation options, medical options, et cetera. I think that jobs is this great equalizer, but via education. I'm a very strong proponent. I'll just respond to say, if you want to create the future and steer the future, you need the highest education. You need to get the graduate courses. You need to have the degrees. You need the certification. There's just no question about it. It is because these things we're talking about on this slide, on the previous slide, every single one of these things is exceptionally complicated. What I didn't say at the beginning of the presentation is my education. I'm educated as a biologist and as a geologist, so science education, very strong base of science, and I think that positions well for the technology field. But you know, I think there's a mixture of people in society of how we make these opportunities available. I think that's a mission of CyberWarrior, by the way, Rainier, and that's why I'm very proud to work with you and to be an advisor and mentor to you for this particular topic.
Thank you. I'm grateful. All right, well, let's continue. I'm sorry that I took you down this rabbit hole, but as you know, economic development is something that I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, so, I also live it. I've gone and I build. You may not know this. I build houses in El Salvador. You know, as part of a project called Epilogos down there, and I'm a big believer in we have to do these things. It's just it's very important. The one thing I will say now back to the pitch. The one thing I will say, I think as technologists and as cybersecurity technologists, I think we tend to have this equation of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I think for an equitable future, which empowers everyone, I think we have to have a different language around this. And these are examples of some of that language. Yeah, it's got to be secure, but it's got to be private. It's got to have high integrity, highly available. It's got to be operable by people. It's got to be maintainable. And I won't go through the entire list, but I really believe it has to be equitable. Because here's a great example why equity is so important. As the world is warming up, 1 degree Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, what happens is the sea level rises, it gets warmer, and what happens is the people who can least afford it are affected by these changes. And I think that every time we have a decision on technology in the future, we have to think about the equitable question. And we have to think about, is it sustainable? And sustainable means, is it without avoidable damage and negative impact? And there's some of the leading companies in the world have this, they have a language called ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance and initiatives. And it's controversial because companies like Citibank, the CEO Jane, is completely focused on this, and that's part of creating a sustainable world. So as technologists and cyber specialists, I expect us to be thinking in the future, not just CIA, but thinking about these other qualities. If it's not equitable, we shouldn't be doing it. If it's not compliant, we shouldn't be doing it. If it's not resilient, we shouldn't be doing it. There's a big comment I've heard in the news recently, the supply chain problems we have. People wanted low cost, but they weren't willing to pay for resiliency in the supply chain. And we're paying the price of that in terms of inflation. Every time you ignore one of these characteristics, someone is going to bear the cost. And part of me says the poor bear the cost of these things more than others. And and that to me is not fair. I think we have to do this. Anyway, these are characteristics. So now I'm going to talk, and I'm going to switch topics now, right? This is the introduction. I'm going to kind of go quickly through the next section because I'm going to talk about cybersecurity's role in this. And I'm going to think, as professionals, what do we have to do differently? Number one, you probably picked up this conversation. This is, by the way, what Rainier and I are getting back and forth on is a very unusual discussion in a cybersecurity talk. Is the world equitable? Are we being sustainable in our practices? Are we helping the poor? That's a very different discussion, but that requires us to think differently. Number two, it requires us to collaborate differently, but exceptionally effectively. What I mean by that is we can't talk at each other. Like Rainier and I just going back and forth, we're actually engaging and sharing, right? We have to think outside the box. We have to embrace ecosystem thinking. In order to do the future, and I'll give you a couple examples, it's not an individual party that does this thing, but a whole series of people. And finally, I think we have to have standard ways of doing things. The one comment I'll make, and this might seem like a very odd comment in a cybersecurity talk. I think in the future, cybersecurity leaders have to think like enterprise architects, meaning they have to think about it holistically, not just on the control of the policy or the operational process or technologies. They have to think about the business, the users, the environment, the development, the infrastructure, and the life cycle. And this requires you to think differently. This is a very hard future thinking. The other thing about the future is the technology stack is becoming exceptionally complex. And this is the highest level I could explain this in, between people, experiences, devices, networks, apps, all the way on the business development, all the way to regulators. These technology stacks are exceptionally complicated. And then you put all these on a distributed cloud, which is not under your control, where 90% of the code was written by someone else. And this creates a cybersecurity nightmare. So I'm going to give about 2 minutes on threat modeling for a moment, and then we'll get into the examples. So in threat modeling, it means we have to think about threat, risk, and impacts in a standard way. And there are two ways to think about threat models. One is a general way, one's a specific way. And in this year, in 2022, these are the top 5 threats we're dealing with today, by the way. And you'll hear this theme as we're talking about the future: sophisticated malware, third-party security, global conflict, and APT, which is advanced persistent threat. Cozy Bear, APT29, APT1. All these things. Open source security, and people aren't part of the workforce, not working in the office, and this creates significant challenges. In one comment I'll say, and Rainier, maybe a future class we'll talk about this, is when we're thinking about threat modeling, which is how do we take all these factors to an application or system. You have to think about this not just across the technologies we just talked about on the other slide. You have to think about them in terms of threats. And I think a wonderful way that a very good friend of mine who used to be on my team, Adam Shostak, explains it is called the STRIDE model. And those of you who are cyber security professionals know the STRIDE model is an industry widely adopted method of thinking about a threat against a specific application or technology component, and then thinking it through and asking yourselves 4 essential questions. Do we know what we're working on? Can we describe all the components? What could go wrong? That was the stride model. What are we going to do about it? And finally, how do we know we did a good job or good enough job? And how do we know that these things were effective? And maybe in a future class, we discuss threat modeling one year, but I think it's a very important practice in this future. And the reason is I'll say this over and over again, 90% of the components to build the future, if you're a company or an organization or government, you don't create them, someone else does. And how do you measure? How do you create threat models? Is it good or not? So that's interesting. So now, if any questions here, because now I'm going to go quickly through 3 areas of future technology. Good. The first area of future technology is electric vehicles, electric charging systems, et cetera. And one, if you want to make yourself laugh, go to Google right now or after the presentation and look up all these traditional companies which has created the carbon problem we have today. General Motors, big trucks, big cars, big Chevys, and nothing wrong with GM. I've owned GM here. They're out there on their websites pushing the electric future. Ford is out there pushing the electric future. No, I'll make a little comment. If anyone on this phone call believes that electric vehicles are going to emasculate, going to remove the masculinity from men or anyone else, by the way, you're crazy. Drive an electric car. These things go fast. They go hard.
Oh my God!
Fun. I'm not going to say who said that comment, but but electric vehicles are going to emasculate the males of the United States. Baloney. Ask anyone who drives a Tesla. It's going to go 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. What?
A buddy of mine. I was in San Jose.
Yeah.
A week ago.
Yeah.
A buddy of mine we were going out to dinner. This thing goes from 0 to 60 in 1.8 seconds. In a span of 5 seconds, we were doing 126.
I don't recommend that. Not on the U.S. roads. I've done that on the Autobahn in Deutschland, but not on the U.S. roads. Remember, so here's my point. This is actually sexy future, but look at these ads these folks are putting on Rivian. I'm starting to see these things all around, and this is an interesting thing. In order to make this work, you need a new charging ecosystem. And I said this over and over again. Remember, 90% of what you're using in businesses you don't create, right? Some energy supplier, PV, whatever, wind, solar, tidal, hydroelectric, whatever. They're going to create the suppliers. Some manufacturer is going to do someone's going to install it. It's going to be charged point operator. Someone's got to pay for it, and then you find you plug your car in. These ecosystems are exceptionally complex. And there's a series of software people that are out there creating this future. And this is just a sample. By the way, this is from last year, but it's a sample of the companies that are out there creating this future. And if you look at it, if you start driving around, you're going to start seeing something, right? You start seeing the Tesla charging stations. You see a Tesla, that's something called a power wall in the upper top of the thing there. You start seeing Shell Oil, BP, putting things out there. You're starting to see also Tesla and everything putting a PV, a photovoltaic system, along with the charging station. So it came from a renewable source, it's stored in Powerwall battery, you can plug your car in, and you haven't caused global warming. Oh, just to give you a number, this is a number I heard today. I was shocked by this number. The daily carbon output in terms of energy we put out in the world is equivalent, I think it was 100,000 Hiroshima bombs every single day. That's how much energy we're putting out. And that energy is 80% of that is absorbed by the oceans, no surprise. And that's an amazing amount of energy we're putting out. It's got to go somewhere. And the point of this slide and these other slides are these traditional players are embracing this because they know this is part of the future. And it's very interesting. There's also a new ecosystem being developed. And this, like Renier, you asked this thing earlier. So companies, any place in the world could create, by the way, the software or the technology around these charging stations, the payment. And by the way, I'm waiting for someone, I mentioned this before, $4 trillion energy market in terms of just gas and diesel. I'm waiting for someone to create the Enron of the solar energy world in terms of credits and buying and swaps and all these other things. But these things come with a whole bunch of new technologies. As cybersecurity people, someone in the future will say, oh, is this ISO 15118 compliant? You'll say, what the heck is that? We have to have known that, right? And it also creates new business models. This was a slide from EY, Ernst Young. And these business models, again, create opportunities, economic opportunities, but also opportunities to transform the world. Let's talk about this briefly from a cyber side. So on a cyber side, we briefly introduced these components: electric vehicles, charging station, renewable energy, battery storage system, and finally, someone's going to pay for this, right? On the threat side, which is on the left, you see what are the threats? And this is a general threat model, not a stride attack model. But you can hack these things. You can cause an accident by hacking a car, by the way. If you haven't seen the videos in this, we can talk about that someday. I can have
and actually,
yeah.
Along those lines, so two things. Well, I want to comment. If you have questions, anybody, please type them into the chat.
Yes.
Q&A or Discord. Just please type them, and we're happy to respond. One of the questions that came up in Discord, Steve,
yes.
was, a comment was that our infrastructure is not built for supporting electric cars, and that we're opening up another security vector. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there's two comments. There's a general and a specific comment. On the general comment is our energy grid in the United States cannot handle all the renewable energy generation, period. I mean, there's just no question about this. The current grid, for example, just in Massachusetts alone, can handle about 6% renewable, and without major changes. But there are people working on those major changes. I think this is the interesting cybersecurity question. This world is moving ahead, by the way. This world is moving ahead because there's trillions of dollars, and if we're there, we can help them, and if we're not, we're going to suffer the consequences. And my comment would be that they're not waiting for cybersecurity experts, even though I'd probably like them to occasionally. They're not waiting for cybersecurity experts to say yes or no. What we're doing is we're playing catch up. And on the upper right-hand side here, I put this in the last minute, but these are companies that are doing leadership positions around this, Rainier, that are running like crazy to make this work. On some of the other slides, you're going to see companies you've never heard of before. Traditional players like Entrust, but my friends at Siemens Digital, as an example, my friend Sean Griffin works there as the CISO. They are trying to secure this as they're building the controllers, which are rolling out to these charging stations. Broadcom, company that's going to be buying VMware next year. Broadcom is building this future while they're doing it, rolling the stuff out with the best security that they can, by the way. And I think that it's I think it's a race. It's a race to get the technology out, to secure it, to make it operational, but also to protect it. And I'll give you a real life example. This is on the left. Stealing payments, by the way, or fake equipment or dangerous or parts. If you make a battery pack, which goes in one of these electric vehicles, and the battery pack is fake, it wasn't manufactured correctly, and you have lithium ion cells in there, these little teeny cells, which are then put into racks of hundreds of them and stuck on the car. If it's fake or is defective at the manufacturing, but somehow gets back in the supply chain, it's dangerous. These cars will catch on fire. Those who are watching TV about what happens when you take a Tesla and you put it in salt water will know what I'm talking about. And they're dangerous. So I think we're in catch up. There's just no way around it. But the companies on the upper right here are really running like mad to try to solve this. And I give a lot of credit to IBM, Siemens, and Broadcom within this space. And then ChargePoint Plus takes these components, plugs them together, and then produces it. And Tesla is in the middle of this also over here. They're creating the future while the train is rolling down the tracks.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that. So another comment that came up is, do you feel that we would be better off building a parallel, new, more modern infrastructure that would be able to actually leverage the new technology, thus reducing the cyber threat?
Yes, and the short answer is yes. The longer, and I'll give you a very specific example. The United States is embarking on the greatest offshore wind generation in place on the planet. In order to do that, there are two methods of building the power grid. That first method is to interconnect it with the current grid, like they are down in Brant Point Station, down in Fall River, and some of these other places. Or should they create a parallel offshore grid of which these things interconnect at nodes, kind of like transmission substations. And I think it'd be safer and more cost effective to build it offshore as a separate parallel power transmission system, and it's separate from the distribution system, and then feed that transmission system into the current system and keep them separate. I think I think that the power systems are very fragile. I think that, and this is no slam on Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a great example of an underinvested power grid, by the way, and the consequences of that. Florida at the moment is a great example of the outages. Down in Texas, the power outages they had last winter was a great example of underinvestment. And I think that it's time to build out a separate power grid in parallel. The challenge is what we call here in New England the NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. So if no one wants to have these big transmission systems or towers put in their backyard, it might ruin their view. Put them in the poor neighborhood, right? So, and that NIMBY problem is real on this. So I think, but the first thing is there's money. It's almost $200 billion in the current budget that was approved by Congress, and signed by the president in order to build this out. I think the exact number is 185 billion, but $200 billion. A lot of money. So the money's there. And you talked about jobs earlier. Think about $200 billion and what the jobs are involved with from here. That's very exciting, in fact. So all these power infrastructures and all these stations and all this technology by all these companies and all this value chain and new business models, there's a lot of jobs here. We're talking trillions of dollars of jobs here. This is big. On the right-hand side, cybersecurity wise, some very traditional controls here. And you're absolutely correct. There's a study when I blew through it very quickly. I'll have it in the 3 slides down from Samsung. I identifying the problems with, and if you give me a couple moments, I'll bring that slide up from here. So that's it on EVs. I'm going to proceed because I'm very sensitive to time also.
Great.
Okay. And we'll come back.
Good. Thank you.
That's the $100 billion question the person asked. That's exactly the right question.
$185 billion.
185 billion. So now let's talk about Industry 4.0 and IoT. So Industry 4.0 is a recognized framework. And here's a case of education, right? There's a language that happens with people who are creating the future. Industry 4.0. I talked about 15.118 in terms of the standards. We're going to talk about that one again in a moment. But here's an example of a framework for Industry 4.0 people are thinking about. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it's about devices, IoT, connection, location, identifications, 3D printing, sensing, etc. This is the language of the future in IoT. But the IoT presents, as the last person asking the question correctly pointed out, IoT creates this huge threat map, huge attack surface in terms of control systems. SCADA is a great example. SCADA systems are used to control utilities, power, water, gas, oil. And there's a traditional attack surface against that, but buildings, energy, consumer, this whole EV stuff we just talked about, this cyber warfare, ransomware, criminal stuff, physical intrusion, et cetera, there's a huge attack surface. We're actually creating a larger attack surface. So to do this right, you only get one shot. Remember, the current electric grid was built in the 1930s in the United States, right? 1930s. How many years ago was that, Vernier? That's 90 years ago. 90 years ago that thing was built. It's going to be here for a while.
It's crazy when you think about that. You think about, going back to the question that we were talking that was made earlier,
right?
Around the legacy and the aging of the infrastructure and how does it stand up to all these new things we're trying to put on top of it.
Oh, it's crazy fragile, and that's why the question of building it.
But at the same time, the innovation is not going to stop.
The innovation, I guess, that's building it in parallel and interconnecting it is probably the safest thing to do. This is actually a question of safety.
Do you feel that that's financially feasible? Like when I saw the question come up, the first thing I thought about, I'm like, well, is that financially feasible?
Yes,
to build it in parallel.
It's actually cheaper. Turns out I mentioned this on the wind generation. The people who are doing the studies on this have determined that it's actually cheaper in order to create this future by building a parallel transmission network. So in the world of the ISOs in the electrical world, you have generation stations, you have transmissions, which take it from a large generation into substations from where it is then distributed out. And that's the language that's used in that. The transmission facilities should be separate than the current legacy 1930s, 90-year-old system. And it also gives you the ability to make changes, by the way, as you fix code or fix devices. So it's very interesting. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but IoT and IoT is a two-way street. Data goes out to centralized control facilities, instructions of turning things on, off, measuring stuff. Data comes in terms of this. And this is a two-way street, by the way, in real time for the entire world, which controls our infrastructure. OWASP did a great job a couple of years ago, meaning for like 2 years ago, in defining for IoT what the vulnerabilities are. Insecure web interfaces, insufficient authorization, authentication, insecure networks, lack of encryption, blah, 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 down to poor physical security. And I'll just say, here's a sobering thing. Samsung did an assessment, and what they discovered, Samsung's a worldwide leader, and not just in terms of phones and things, but in terms of building, especially medical systems, enterprise building systems, HVAC, all these control systems, et cetera. They've done an early assessment, just like the person asking the question was about. 80% of the devices had privacy, meaning that they leaked data. They were on unencrypted networks. They collected personal information, and they allowed attackers, by the way, to guess the admin accounts, guess the accounts. And the reason is you have to remember who's building these systems, okay? And the people that are building these systems are engineers working on, on different types of low-end equipment, and they start off on their bench tops and in their labs, and and they have never exposed this stuff to hackers, and I will tell you a true story. We met with a medical company about 2 years ago, making a cardiac monitor and software. And we started to ask them, and so they could gather information for a cardiologist and the doctor to administer either, drugs or electric shock to the patient, or to bring the patient in because the heart was failing. And we asked them some basic questions around this very thing. And it turns out that they, going back to it had insecure web interface. It was unencrypted. They had no authentication. It was completely insecure mobile interfaces. There was no security on the thing in terms of configuration. There was no software update process, and you could open the device up. This is a heart monitor, of which is life and death. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you should know that there are standards committees that are out there working on the standards by how you edit industrial scale, meaning 50 billion, 100 billion device scale, how you bring these things together. What are the operational models and nodes you need to do? There are people working on this right now, but this stuff is bleeding edge. When I say bleeding edge, I mean it's bleeding edge. And so if you look up this framework, you'll discover all these papers, how you add a device to a network, remove a device, update a device, add policies to it, contracts, what's supposed to do and not do, put them on blockchains, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do I do charging for it, et cetera. So this world is being developed, all right? So now let's just talk about how to protect this. And I'm going very fast for the sake of time. But and how do we protect this? So the threats, by the way, are very similar to the ones we talked about. I can hack the gear. I can shut down the network. I can pretend I can spoof a device and get to the stride model. I can steal data. I can put fake equipment out there. I can make fake telemetry on the heart monitor, on industrial equipment. I can cause operational outages or stability, and I can kill people. And if you don't believe that, by the way, if you don't believe that you can kill someone, think about what happened, and without mentioning the country that did this, to the Iranian centrifuges, right? A very, very, very famous hacking case, and the Siemens controllers were saying that the device is spinning at a certain speed, 5,000 or 50,000 RPMs. The reality is the attacker were speeding them up, doing fake data, and the things blew up and killed everyone at the facility that was doing uranium concentration of uranium from uranium 238 to 235 in order to make bombs, by the way, but blew the facility up underground, thank God. So you can kill people with this stuff. You can kill people with the power equipment. You can kill people with gas, with water, with other systems, etc. And these components have sensors. We just talked about this. This is all brand new. Telemetry, networks, cloud, and management systems. The cybersecurity side is immature, but there's a whole new wave of companies here, and that are working on this. And a lot of these names you recognize. We've talked about before: IBM, Siemens, VMware, Broadcom, DigiCert, and Trust, etc. So I'm hopeful in this. For the sake of the time, I'm going to go through the next one very quickly because there's a whole new generation of things, and this has to do with smart cities. And so smart cities is how to improve the quality of people's lives using technology, innovation, and automation. And so the first question is, what is a smart city? And I won't bore you to death, but it's essentially the interconnection of things: agriculture, data, retail, Wi-Fi, government, smart grids, etc., in a way which is useful for equity, for culture, creativity, and quality of life. And it's about real-time urban informatics. If you haven't heard about informatics, is a hot buzzword in the world of data and in computing. It's about gathering sensor data and doing something useful with it, whether it's for help the environment, for safety, transportation, utilities, and the buildings. This is a very important part of the future. Water is one of the things which makes this critical. We'll talk about this in a moment, but so this is all part of the future of smart cities. And let's use water as a very specific example. So these are some projections. These are all from the UN, a couple of agencies, but essentially they figure by 2015, half the world's population will live where water is scarce, right? The infrastructure in most water systems is 80 years old, right? New York City, 36 million gallons leaks every day from the New York City water supply. At the same time, we're seeing around the slide headlines. Water.
You said 36 million gallon leak?
Leak.
Wow.
Right.
Imagine the waste on that. That's incredible.
Yeah. So on the right hand side,
the environmental impact.
Oh, it's crazy, right? And you read the headlines right now. You can go to I put up the Los Angeles Times, any place around the United States right now. Water is the most important economic thing. It's about life, by the way. We don't have water to drink, to cook, to bathe, to clean. We're back to the Stone Age, right? And it's an area where people are really trying to solve it. And remember what's at the core of the current set of water problems. I would say maybe 80% of the core is global warming, because it changes climate patterns, warms the earth up, rain falls different places. Just ask someone who lives, in the Asian subcontinent of India, the places with the change in the monsoons, etc. This is one of the big critical problems of the future, by the way. And one thing I flashed up, I didn't spend much time on it, is on this slide. In District of Columbia at the moment with smart meters, it takes them only 15 minutes for them to detect a leak and then get an alert out and start fixing it. But New York City losing 36 million gallons of water a day. Imagine what that could do to Los Angeles, to Las Vegas, out to the hard-hit drought areas of the Midwest and the Southwest. It's an amazing thing. So let's talk about the threats against that. And if you look at the industry leadership board, there's a bunch of new players in this space that are just, you've never heard of these companies before. And, I was working with this company in the UK, in Gorka, and it just has come up because they're trying to do security technology around IoT. People are trying to go with water sensing systems. Ubiquity is coming up with, they call them quantum sensors, how to put sensors all around cities and measure these things. Again, I mentioned earlier, worked in Beijing, China. And Beijing's building a smart city. And what they're trying to do is control traffic and air pollution and noise and quality of life. So the components are sensors, to everything. There's a bunch of utilities: power, water, light, gas, the network utilities. There's a bunch of network protocols involved. There's third parties, and finally, there's a bunch of control systems. So think about the hacking involved with attacking a water system. And if you don't believe this happens, this does happen to the SCADA systems on water. You can attack the control systems so that they put in too much chlorine into a water system. I don't put enough chlorine in. And you can actually kill or sicken people through these by changing the operations of a city, by the way. Misleading information. You can put out misleading information causing political unrest. You can steal utilities and surge. You can disrupt the public services. And
that's similar. Yeah. That's similar to attack in Florida. What was it, 2 years ago? They were trying to attack the water supply.
Yeah.
You remember that one? Yeah.
No, this is and these are our precious resources. So if we're going to control this in the future, we're cybersecurity people have got to step up and have a new language around this. These technologies, which we've been talking about here, again on these water systems, these are so complicated that I'll just say that humans can't understand these things. This was our discussion with Beijing, is that humans cannot understand these systems in real time. We can understand them months, years later, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so this yes.
On that note, how are one of the questions from the community, yes, are underdeveloped countries able to get any of these levels of connectivity in the next 20 years?
Here's the great thing. The cost, and this is why this is so great, Rainier, is technology is a great equalizer. And the reason is, which is not obvious to people, is that the cost of doing these technologies, even 5G, the price point is so low compared to what it was 20 years ago that any country in the world can deploy these things. The danger, this was a real life story, is we did a project with CB Telecom in Cabo Verde off West African coast, and they were putting in these smart city systems and thinking about this for near. And what they discovered was these things don't take a lot of money, but if you don't have a lot of money, third parties on the outside come up and offer you loans and money, like Huawei and the Chinese government, by the way. And so I think there's a future, and I'm going to use the word, which is a very powerful word, but it makes sense in this one. I think there's a future economic enslavement that people are envisioning here, of technology being supplied by rich countries, and I'll use China as a very specific example, which locks these countries in for the next century to be beholden to them. But the good news here, Rainier, is these technologies are low cost. Again, in Cabo Verde voting systems, they were using iPads, loading up them, voting machines, secure software, send them out to every one of the islands and all that, collect them back, with transparent results reported online. It doesn't cost that much anymore. So I think the entry point to do these things, even in the poorest countries in the world, is actually quite low now. And I think that I think that part of economic equality, by the way, has to do with technical equity that gives you access to these systems like protecting water supplies. And imagine the poor people in Flint, Michigan. Again, put up a slide earlier. Average water pipe age in these cities are 80 years old. 80 years old, by the way. And if you're putting a new water system in to a country or a community, you have a chance to put in the current technology with the latest monitoring and make it transparent so people can watch the water quality, and you don't get into these problems. You avoid the problem.
And then, yeah. But how secure are these systems now? I mean, you've got this, much lower. Well, and that's the point, right? So you've got much lower barrier of entry in terms of lower cost technology.
Yes.
But then you got a very high cost around securing them.
Yes, but security must be built in. And if you look at some of these companies that put up on the leadership board here up on the upper right, they're actually working on this. So when they roll the controller out, Rainier, it has security built in. Angoka, by the way, is working on it. So you have a secure network which has a web of trust between the components. So that if a component joins the network either verifies or rejects the component. And it's a very interesting place to experiment with cyber technology theory, by the way. And I talked about this problem of trust. It's not so much zero trust. It's how do I grant and confirm and validate trust through behavior. And I think that these companies work like Siemens, IBM, Broadcom. I think are working very hard right now on this veneer. I give an immediate response saying these things are not secure, and as an ecosystem they are not. But these companies are working like crazy. WorldLink's a good example. Working like crazy to make these things secure veneer. So,
yeah, no, and I mean, there's product security, as you know, is key. I mean, I serve on a few advisory boards and things like that for different healthcare institutions, and it's pretty concerning in terms of the risks associated with medical devices, as an example. Which, I mean, talk about something with an immediate impact, right? You talk about your water supply, food supply,
right.
Electrical grids, but it doesn't get much closer to home than a heart pacer.
Absolute possibility. And what operating system do a lot of those hospital equipment run on? Windows XP, by the way. And what are the hacker boys with ransomware like to go after? Windows XP. So we have a technology debt. We have a technology debt problem, Rainier, with these old technologies that never get out. And I said this earlier, and I really was serious about this. I think there's an opportunity for countries and communities to get the latest technology without the technology debt of these old platforms. But on the other hand, I would not be naive to think that the hackers are not attacking the systems. It really takes professional, real strong professional knowledge. Again, Stride Model is a great example of that. To take any component in like the medical system and figure out how can I hack it? How can I spoof it? How can I tamper with it? What's the repudiation process on it? How can I, steal the data? How can I do DDoS against it? These things, it is very hard discussions, but I think it's a responsibility of technologists and us as cybersecurity professionals, to keep on moving the art forward. But it has to happen through standard ways of doing it, certified technologies, and with an eye towards an ethical responsibility to protect them from hacking. I'm going to watch the time, but I'm watching the time.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, no. So am I. So we have a question from the crowd here.
Yes.
So thank you for a very insightful discussion. You mentioned cybersecurity is playing catch up with technological development. Building in strong security during development would be an upfront financial investment, but may help the production to be successful and save costs by preventing attacks in the long run. Do you know of an example in which this has played out in real life, meaning a product or company that stood out from the competition or lasted because it was built with cybersecurity in mind?
Yeah, that I think is a great question. There's a very famous, I'll respond at three levels: at the theoretical, then I'll respond with two company examples. There's a theoretical discussion around software quality and fixing it when in the life cycle. IBM had done a series of studies back 10, 15 years ago around this that basically showed over and over and over again the cost of fixing a bug at the very early integration testing phases, QA phases, versus later on in production is like 10 to 1. It could actually be 100 to 1, but it's depending on the exact equipment. So there's a real use case for understanding the quality of software very, very early on in the development life cycle in order to work this. Now I'm going to give you two examples why I'm so strong about this thing. I've worked with a company that did in the DevSecOps space, a company called Zero North here in Boston. I was an investor and advisor and a great advocate for this space. And I really believe that you have to provide, because these things are incredibly complicated when you're writing systems, and you have to provide tools to developers that meet them where they are at that point in life cycle through automated code analysis, through using approved interfaces, to understanding something called SBOMs, the software bill of material within a build. Any of you on the phone who know how to use Docker, et cetera, know that you can go into Docker and look at a container with an and get the SBOM, the bill of materials, out of the container, and know what's in it. What's lacking in the DevSecOps space is really 3 or 4 things. First thing is a standard discipline. The second thing has to do with standard sets of tools and interfaces around those tools and how to collect them across a very complex ecosystem. So I'm a big believer in DevSecOps. We built out a practice at that, and I was a sponsor of it, and very, very smart people there built out a very effective practice at SAP around this space, and it's still growing, and it pays dividends. But you have to have the disciplines around these things, understanding around containerization, how you promote things through different parts of the development life cycle, and how to measure it through SBOMs and other types of things. But you have to build systems that take all these components and understand where the threats are, and which are very difficult. The other thing I'll say about this one is a fidelity example. As I said very early on the presentation, I worked on fidelity on the internet rollout, and I ran internet services, and I was the SVP of cybersecurity there. But one of the things we had done there is we had built a very early on secure development practice, so secure development life cycle there, and you're required to get training on different types of software interfaces. You're required to go through both static and dynamic code analysis. We did reporting on that. You could self-report it when you did certain transitions, but we engaged the development very early on in the process through training and tools, and then we could measure it. We could look at defects per lines of code, 1,000 lines of code, 1,000,000 lines of code, and then we could test that over time. So my personal experience is that it's worth the investment. It was exceptionally high in the early days without tools. But later on, Veracode came in, AppSec came in, a bunch of open source tools came in, but we're still lacking, I think, an overarching architecture of collecting these components and then getting kind of a risk heat map around software to understand where bad packages are, like Log4j, or some of these other things, or some of the other Apache projects, and which, like, Spring and Struts or some of the other ones, which have had various problems. And you need a way that gives yourself visibility to the current state, but also has the tools that allow the developers to analyze, and the risk managers and the QA managers, analyze the code very early on before it gets pushed out of the initial build process or later on into the production system. So my own personal experience is this is doable. At the moment, it's very hard. I think people are trying to solve it. It's solvable. The last thing I will say, that legally, within certain industries, connected with the federal government, connected with the OCC and the FDIC banking, and connected with the SEC and FINRA, there is a requirement around this, that you build a program around third parties, including software, that you establish things that allow you to inventory, identify all the components, be able to risk rate it, have a process around understanding the threats. Can you mitigate the threats through software, et cetera? And it's certainly a VM, we're working on a series of things to do automatic threat remediation based on the knowledge of an exposed package underneath it, and popping up in real time a firewall control or other WAF control around these things. So I have great hope on this. I don't think there's an overarching architecture for DevSecOps yet, Renier. That's a very long-winded way of giving a quick answer.
Yeah, I don't know that was a quick answer, but it certainly was a thorough one. I continue to be amazed on how you put together all these different pieces of knowledge and experience.
Well, but I do.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll make a comment. I'm in the middle of a Kubernetes training class, hands-on, by the way, of taking Docker containers, using Kubernetes to bring up the nodes and push everything out and manage it. And I'm actually quite nervous around this now, getting hands-on training on this stuff, because I can see the vulnerabilities. We of course have products of the VMware side around the security of this, but I can understand, and now I understand, I think, some of the systemic vulnerabilities of these technologies. But I also understand the value of why use Docker and why use containers and why use Kubernetes. Very useful for enterprises.
And that's the challenge, right? You're always trying to balance risk reward, trying to balance innovation versus cost containment.
Yeah, and you, can I wrap it up now, Rainier, you think?
Yes, please.
Okay, we're wrapped up. So call to action. I think I'll just say from the beginning, and you can probably tell from Rainier and I conversation, we're in this together. And Rainier and I have worked with each other, we've known each other 7 or 8 years now. And I think we're in this together. I don't think any company solves this by themselves. I don't think any of you on this phone call can do it. I think we're in this together. And I think that for the cybersecurity community and the professionals within that community, I think there's great opportunities. Everything we've talked about here, though you have identified it correctly as problems, also represents an opportunity, by the way, because someone's got to solve these things, you know, and I think that this requires new roles, new skills, and new tools. I think on the new skills side, you know, this is a lot of training involved. And I'm being very practical here. I'm taking Kubernetes training, which means I have to go install these things and put on virtual machines. I have to go do Docker, understand container, how to push stuff out, do the whole thing. You have to get trained on this stuff. The stuff is complex, and there's no doubt about that, by the way. And they're not going to get less complex for quite a while. And I think methodology-wise, I think people here on the call, threat modeling and STRIDE and risk analysis, I think these things are very important. And I think the regulators are going to come down quite hard on people around these things. I think there's very high demand continues. I'll just give you an industry stat. Year over year, the spend on cybersecurity within the Fortune 500 is up about 30% year over year. So I think the investment is there despite inflationary pressures, despite, you know, all of these things going on. And I think this is continuing high demand. So the opportunities on education, training, certifications. And I think the other part of it is, and we're going to talk about it here a little bit tonight, is it's our jobs to contribute. And this goes back to my comment to run this together. It's our job to contribute to the community at large, by the way, writ large, meaning through cybersecurity awareness month, right? What are we doing about it? Talking about phishing and talking about that. I think on the skilling side, I think Black Girls Code's a great example of engaging at the high school level, you know, different communities. I think STEM education. I really think we got something going here, and I think we have to give back to the community. I think we owe it to everyone to do that. And with that, I think that is the end of the talk.